Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on the recent episodes. We're inching very, very close to our goal of 50 subs. Please help us get to our goal by liking and subscribing, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so I mean, at this point, we're getting pretty close to the end of the regular season. Obviously, lots of stuff happening, right? We're kind of seeing, I think, a little bit more of a separation of, like the teams that have some more juice left and then some teams that don't. We'll go over, some of the games since the last time, that we got together, right? So obviously, you had games like, say, the Mavs and the Celtics, right? The Boston, they won 138 to 110. Boston's pretty much been doing this to everybody, right? At this point, where, every other night it feels like they're blowing the team away. Um, and it's kind of interesting when you look at the game from a Mavs standpoint, right? Because for a while, right, it was kind of a competitive game, right? For the most part, Boston would generally go up by as much as like 12, 15 for a while, and then Dallas would kind of get it back into single digits, but then Boston, pretty much controlled the game. Um, and Boston, right? They are 48-12. They got another big win, which we'll get into momentarily. But again, they have the best record in the NBA. They've been great, all year, right? Basically number one offense. I think they've overtaken Indiana, right, as the number one offense because it was them for a while. Now it's Boston, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they've also obviously had a top five defense. Um, but from the Mavs side, right, they've gone, they're 6-4 in their last 10. They have lost two in a row though. The Boston loss wasn't great, but the one that was pretty rough was the loss to Philly, right? Philly without Joel Embiid. Still have Tobias Harris and Tyrese Maxey and Buddy Hield and Oubre and others. But these last two losses still I feel like kind of highlight some of the flaws with the Mavs team where it's just like defensively, it just feels like that's gonna be kind of their issue, right? Where like and that's gonna be probably one of the problems for them in the postseason is if they're gonna win, it's probably gonna be by outscoring the other team. It's probably gonna be very difficult for them to be able to um, just kind of get enough stops to be able to pull out a win. Obviously, if it's a close game, right, they can kind of trade you they can kind of trade baskets back and forth, and that could be the type of game that they might win. Can they do it 4 out of 7 times? Though that's the difficulty, right? And they've dropped to the eighth seed now. And they are one loss. They only have one less loss than Golden State.
Yeah.
Who's the nine, and then I guess two fewer losses than the Lakers who are in 10. So that's kind of a tough spot, to be in. Obviously, these things can change, right? But Sacramento and Phoenix, they have two fewer losses than Dallas, so now Dallas has a little bit more ground that they're going to have to make up, and that's going to be a tough spot when it felt like they had won like 6, 7 in a row, and they were like in the 5, 6 spot, but now they're 8, and it may be a little more likely they're in the play-in. We'll see. It just kind of depends on how the schedules go. Dallas's schedule is kind of middle of the pack, but say Phoenix and Sacramento have two of the tougher schedules, but still not great. But again, like, a loss to Boston isn't the big deal, but the Philly one is the rough one. And it just, like I said, it seems to continue to highlight some of the issues defensively with this team. Plus, say a guy like a Tim Hardaway Jr. has been in a little bit of a slump. And, if he has a game where he's not really getting it rolling, and then Kyrie wasn't great until like, the final stretch of the game when the game was kind of already out of reach.
Yeah.
That's the tough part for Dallas. But again, that's the gamble that they made is that they pretty much have kind of said, like, yeah, we're not really a defensive team. We're gonna beat you by outscoring you. And they're starting to get more healthy now, so obviously, this stuff can change. They can kind of figure out some of the rotations, but um they do have more big man depth. But still, it still doesn't feel like it's, ideally where you would like it to be. Like I said, with Washington, he still isn't really like a great outside shooter. But again, it's still an upgrade. It's just it may not necessarily be enough for them to be able to, you know, get where they would probably like to go. But you just never know because if you get the right matchup, then you may have the advantage over some of these other teams. So that's where you kind of just have to wait and see, right? But obviously, if you're Dallas, you don't really want to be in the play in.
Yeah, and that's the big thing. I think that's the biggest question that a lot of us have. And I think it all stems from consistency. I think we all can admit that Luka Doncic is amazing, but the Dallas Mavericks as a whole are probably one of the more inconsistent teams on both ends of the floor. Where you look at Kyrie, who's a guy who produces, but he hasn't been there all the way this season. I think everybody knows that, and even the other pieces around him, like Derek Lively, he looks good, and then sometimes he doesn't look too good. PJ Washington, very streaky right now. So there's a lot of pieces that they do need to figure out, especially like Tim Hardaway Jr., like you're saying. Like, and I heard a great from what's his name? I think it was either Rich. I think it was Richard Jefferson when he was commentating on the game between Dallas and Boston, where Tim Hardaway Jr. is kind of being forced into taking bad shots, but at the same time, you gotta have the IQ to know when to not take that kind of shot. And he was saying, he's a guy who has the green light, and I think he's earned he's earned the right to have the green light because he is a great player and a great shooter. But when you're not hitting, you need to learn how to like move the ball and just get things going in other places. And I think that's one thing where we need to look at the Mavericks. Like sometimes it doesn't look like there's a solid sense of structure, but they're kind of relying and banking on Luka and maybe Kyrie to carry them to victories, and that's just not really going to take you very far, especially come playoff time, because that's all that really matters right now. Like, we're in the regular season and we're getting to that home stretch where there's about like 20 games left, but things are pretty much set. Like everybody who's in the top 10 is probably going to be in play-in playoff territory. It's just a matter of how far are you going to go, and I think this level of play needs to change because I'm just baffled by how inconsistent this team really is outside of Luka.
Yeah, and that's kind of the frustrating part because
Yeah,
when they're at their best, right, that's where they look like, okay, this team may be able to make a solid run,
for
and
sure.
then the floor is a little bit low. I mean,
Very.
you would think it would be higher. And again, like you don't complain too much because they have not really lost too many of their recent games, but
Sure.
they have now fallen to 6-4 in the last 10, which is still good. But then when you look at the rest of the teams around them, they're no longer keeping pace quite as much.
Right.
And now they're starting to fall behind a little bit more. So that's where some of this stuff is going to have to be sorted out. If they want to be able to do something, because I mean, ideally, if you're Dallas, you don't really want to be in the play-in. I mean, obviously, they're 8, so if the playoffs were today or play-in was today, they'd be playing Sacramento. You probably don't feel too bad about playing the Kings,
Sure.
although in a one-off game situation, right, that could be potentially a problem.
I'm still
Um,
taking Dallas. I'm in my opinion, but I think it just speaks like to how competitive the West really is because I don't think 34-27 is a bad record. I don't think their stats are horrible, as far as where they stand in the West. But just looking around, like we got 3 teams in the West that are in the 40s in terms of games won, and then obviously you got the Clippers that are close. It's really tight, and there's so much talent there, and I think that's the problem. They're just searching for consistency, and I hope they find it because this is a team that I'm really and was really high on last year, and I'm still kind of high on and had hopes on them, producing in the playoffs. But I don't know, not with this level of play though.
Yeah, and then Bucks Bulls, right? We don't really have to talk about the game itself, right? But now
Yeah,
the Bucks have won 5 in a row, 7 of their last 10. The defense has been a lot better.
yeah,
How much of that has been the last few games they've been playing against some not so great competition
sure.
versus them actually figuring some stuff out. I think it's a mix of both.
Hmm.
Um, but either way, right? You take what you can get, right? And again, they've gone back to the 2 seed with the Cavs losing to the Knicks. So I mean, again, like the thing with the Bucks is that like you can't count them out because of Giannis and Lillard, and there is a world where like you know they could figure it out in a playoff series and then just get hot. And if they get hot, right, that's where they could potentially be a problem for some of these other teams. Like say Cleveland or the Knicks, or Orlando or Miami or somebody like that. So
Yeah,
um, I feel like a lot of the teams below them, right, like that are in that 6 to 8 spot are probably going to try to, avoid them, because they're probably going to be somewhere between like 2 to 3. And just kind of, because just in terms of the Knicks are the 4 seed, they have 25 losses, right? So that's 4 more losses than the Bucks. And that's not that's a lot of ground to cover with like 20 games left, basically. Um, so, I feel like that's going to be something to also watch is like, these teams, what are they going to do in terms of like trying to figure out who they would like to play in the first round? The lower seeds more so than the higher seeds, right? Because again, for a team like Indiana, maybe you actually do feel okay about playing the Bucks in the first round. Maybe not, but like I feel like Cleveland, I think, is kind of the interesting one where I feel like teams may try to position themselves to play them. Even though the thing about Cleveland is they've actually been very good, for for most of the latter part of the season, even with guys being in and out of the lineup, right? Obviously, they've been 500 as of late, because Donovan Mitchell's been out.
Yeah.
And he was one of the biggest reasons, other than Jared Allen, for why they had that crazy stretch where they were just winning every game.
Mhm.
But I don't know. But I mean, with the Bucks, I feel like it's good to see them have a better stretch after like a really rough start with Doc, because now they've won 5 in a row and they are looking better. It's obviously we're just gonna have to see how it looks in the postseason.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the thing. Like, it's so weird because things will eventually even out and take care of themselves. Like, we're gonna be able to see who's real and who's really fake and who's like a fraud. And I still feel like the Bucks are a little bit fraudulent. I'm not too sold on the record. 40-21 is a great record. They've accomplished some great things. You have historic performances, great performances from guys like Giannis. It's just come playoff time, are they really going to be cohesive? Are they going to gel together? Is Doc Rivers going to be able to fight, a coach's battle? Is he going to be able to win those? Like, I have no issues with them, like, getting out of the first round. It's a matter of, can they win the second? Can they get to the conference finals? Can they get to the finals? I just don't know, considering that there are a lot of teams like Boston, I think, that are, right there. Like, they're a little bit better. You feel better about Boston than you would Milwaukee. Um, and like Cleveland, I think they're a team where they might be in the fraud territory too. I don't know how far they would go in the playoffs, to be honest, considering what we saw last year, although they have been very good this season. But then also, would it really even matter? Because are any of these teams actually well equipped to beat a team in the West? Like, if when it comes to it, say one of those teams does get to the finals, whether it be Boston, Milwaukee, Cleveland, or another team in the East, are they going to beat OKC, Minnesota, Denver, LA? Are they going to beat these teams? I don't think so. So it could be all for naught. But regardless, Boston is the best team in the NBA, I think, right now. Milwaukee, still fraudulent on them. Cleveland, I don't really feel too crazy about them, just considering that when they're not healthy, they still can't win. But when they are healthy, I feel a little bit better about them because you do have some solid pieces like Evan Mobley, Jared Allen,
Mhm.
Donovan Mitchell, who's been balling. I think Darius Garland has taken a little bit of a slip, considering like the trajectory that he was on in previous years. Where he was an all-star, but now you kind of feel like, okay, maybe he needs a little bit more time to develop completely. But I think they have some solid pieces, along with like New York. I think the East is like solid. It's just not as good as the West. Simple as that.
Yeah, yeah, I do like with Cleveland. I like some of the shooters that they added because they've
Sure.
been one of the
Oh yeah,
best
Sam
3-point
Merrill.
shooting. Yeah, Sam Merrill, Max Strus, I guess, even a guy like a Niang. Like they've been a better 3-point shooting team this year, one of the better ones in the league, and I think that's helped them offensively,
Yeah,
right? To a point where like maybe in a playoff series, you may not feel quite as like you might feel like, okay, we can play with one of those bigs and we can put like, some other shooters alongside of them and we may not be in quite as bad of a spot. We'll see. But it's just again with Cleveland, it's Ken Mobley and Allen work together in the postseason. But I think the thing that you mentioned about will any of these teams beat the Western Conference teams? The thing that I think kind of like this weekend almost kind of spelled out to me is that it kind of feels like in the West, you know, I know you mentioned teams like Minnesota and OKC, but I still feel like it kind of runs through the Nuggets. I think the Clippers
agreed.
are, probably a close second. Obviously, you look at what, those two teams were able to do, over the weekend, right? Like, the Nuggets, they beat the Lakers again. And then say with the Clippers, right? They had a game where they didn't really play well against Minnesota, but they were able to play well enough to close out the game.
Sure.
Where you can kind of feel like the issues that Minnesota has offensively with that group. And that's kind of the thing where like I just feel like, in the West, it still runs through Denver. I know Golden State has been playing better. Obviously, they got very much obliterated today
Yeah,
by
that was an
the
evisceration.
right. I know what they lost by 50 or whatever and
Yeah.
but
And
and
speaking about
that's and that's
Boston, I think they're the only team in NBA history to do that, three times in a season where they beat
right,
a team by 50 plus points. So that
right.
tells you how historic they are offensively and defensively.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Boston where like it's just I don't know because the issue, the thing about the Nuggets, right, is that we saw it in the Laker game, right, where like whenever they're in a relatively close game, you feel pretty much better about them than pretty much any other team. Even if a team plays well with them for 3.5 quarters, can you be able to slow down, their two-man game in the last few minutes? Can you kind of slow down some of the other guys? And that's the tough part. And, I think Boston is, we said Milwaukee may be a better matchup for the Nuggets than the Celtics in the sense of like Milwaukee may be able to beat the Nuggets more so than
Yeah,
the Celtics. But, with the way the Celtics have played, maybe Boston might just be the better team, compared to Milwaukee.
that's
And they
how I
may
feel.
just be able to beat the Nuggets because of their talent. But then, you still have to wonder, like, hey, with the Nuggets, if it gets to a close game, right, and you got to figure out a way to score effectively, is Boston going to kind of revert back to some of the issues offensively that they've had in previous years? Or they're gonna figure it out, right? Like Porzingis didn't play against Golden State. And honestly, like the thing with Boston is like their record without Porzingis has actually been fine, right? It's not
Yeah,
like they're way below 500. They're pretty,
they
they're
can live
still
without
above.
him.
Yeah, yeah. It's just obviously in order to win in the postseason, if you want to win the title, that's where you need him. If he needs to be healthy,
Hmm.
in order for Boston to win the title, I think he's kind of the X factor for them.
Agreed.
In a similar way where like, like a Jamal Murray, is the X factor for the Nuggets, right? If he, continues to elevate his game in the playoffs, right? To, because again, in the regular season, he's, basically an all-star guy, right? Like where he's really good, but again, he's an all-star. But then in the playoffs, he turns basically into an all NBA guy, right? And if you get that version of Jamal Murray with what you already get from Jokic, then that may just be too much. And it feels weird because, sometimes Denver's in an interesting spot where, we were kind of wondering last year in the playoffs, right, what are we going to get from the other guys? But they gave them enough, on both ends of the floor,
For sure.
to where, they were able to win it out. And I still feel like the Nuggets, I think the road to the title still goes to the Nuggets. I know the Celtics have been the best team.
Hmm.
Um, like I said, I think the Clippers have the best shot in the West to take out the Nuggets if
Hmm.
they're healthy.
Hmm.
Um, but I still feel like the Nuggets are better. It's just a matter with the Clippers. Obviously, health is a factor, although health is a factor for every team, but some more so than others. Um, but the Clippers, I think in the West are the one team that's got the shot because you have a guy in Kawhi, who can pretty much do what he does on both ends, pretty much at any point, right? Like he's obviously been great this season.
Yeah.
Paul George obviously is a co-star, right? He can those two guys together defensively can cause some problems for Denver's guards and whatnot. Obviously the Nuggets. It'll be interesting to see who they throw at one of Kawhi or Paul George or Harden. And with Harden, right, obviously that's the other factor where he's their point guard. You don't have to have him score, 30 points a game like he had to before in previous stops. Now he
Yeah.
could have like 15 points and 8 assists, and that would be enough, for the Clippers to pull out a win. But that's the main thing, right? For the Clippers, when they're at their best, that's probably enough to be able to do it. It's just a matter of again, can you still trust Harden? Because again, like they don't need Harden to be the Harden of old, but I think he still has to be relatively productive. Now,
He has to show
obviously, I
up.
think
He can't do what he did last year.
yeah. Now the floor is lower because again, he's no longer the number two option or like the whatever. You know what I mean? Like so, the
Sure.
floor is lower. He could have a stinker of a game, but then it's made up for like because Paul George has a really good game or Kawhi just has like a backpack type
Yeah.
game. But I think that's kind of what we saw in the West. Is it's pretty much those two teams because I feel like the other teams like, they could those other teams might be able to win a series or two, but I just feel like they're probably, against those teams, that's probably where the road ends. I feel like the Clippers are definitely more beatable than the Nuggets for most teams. Like, let's say there's a world where Golden State somehow pulls it out and gets to the conference finals, and it's not the Nuggets, it's the Clippers. Like they might have a decent shot at beating the Clippers. Like I don't think you would pick them, but
Hmm.
they may have more of a chance. But the Nuggets, I think it's a bad matchup. Same with the Lakers, the Suns. It's kind of hard to kind of really know what you're getting because there's been so few games with
Yeah.
all of them,
They're the wild card, in
available.
my opinion.
Yeah, they're kind of the wild card one where if they're healthy, they might be able to do something. They obviously have some weaknesses too, right? And some of those weaknesses kind of fall into Denver's hands, right? Where it's like Phoenix can get kind of stagnant in fourth quarters, and if that happens against the Nuggets, you're not winning.
Yeah.
Um,
Lack of
so that
defense, lack of
yeah,
size at time.
right. Yeah, so they're kind of the other wild card team, but I would still probably say if it's not the Nuggets in the West, then it's probably the Clippers. Um, and then it kind of and like you said, that's kind of the question is whoever comes out of the East, are they going to be able to beat the team in the that comes out of the West? Because if
Yeah.
it's one of those two teams, that may be a tall task. We have, such limited amounts of like, data in terms of how they play. Because, again, those teams only play twice a season. The Nuggets played the Celtics one time, right, earlier in the year,
Yeah.
right, and it was a similar type of game, right, where like Boston was up for a decent amount, but at the end of the game in the last 5 minutes, the Nuggets pulled it out. The Clippers played the Celtics earlier in the year too. That was one without Porzingis, and they smashed Boston.
Yeah.
So I mean, that was one of the only. I think, yeah, Boston's only lost at home 3 times. One was to the Clippers, the other was to the Nuggets, right? Those are the two other top tier Western teams, and then the other one was the Lakers. That was that weird game where LeBron and AD didn't play.
Mm-hmm.
So
Oh yeah, that was
I
funny.
don't know. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it definitely feels different in Boston this year, where it definitely feels like there's been an identity shift offensively, where they're a
Sure.
lot more organized and just a lot more potent and dangerous on the offensive end, while still being able to defend at a high level. I mean, because in that Warrior game, like Golden State couldn't do anything. I mean, like
Yeah.
obviously Boston shot the lights out of the ball, and that kind of, when you shoot 60% and a half, that helps contribute to a big lead. But also part of it was they were literally just shutting down everything Golden State was doing.
Yeah. But does it
I
all
mean, and
matter? Because I think the problem that people have with Boston is we see them play at an elite level almost every year, with this core group of guys in, the regular season, but then come postseason, something does happen. Although, they did go to the finals. Regardless, an appearance isn't enough. I don't think that's enough to make me feel like, okay, yeah, this team is going to win the finals. I just feel like there's always something, there's always a meltdown, there's always some sort of storyline that creeps in and just kind of screws this team over. And I think it's time for them to shut, the haters up, flip
yeah,
the script and switch up the narrative. And like, I'd be down for them to actually go to the finals and win it because I think they deserve it because that's how good this team really is. It's just a matter of
yeah,
can
I
they
think
do it in the postseason?
yeah, I think for them, because unlike the Nuggets, there's no pressure for the Nuggets because they've already won
Yeah.
a title, so they don't have any additional stuff to prove.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like whereas with Boston, right, they've made deep playoff runs every year, including, as you mentioned, the finals appearance where they
Yeah.
came up short. And now they did what we said they should do after they lost last year, right? Where we said they needed to make some relatively sizable changes,
Yeah.
and they did. They brought in Porzingis, they brought in Drew Holiday. Those changes so far have worked, but now the question is, will they be able to put it together and actually pull off, winning the title this season?
Yeah.
And that's the part where we'll see. And again, they have, like to me, if they don't come out of the East, like that would be kind of like a massive disappointment
That'd
because
be a
when
failure,
you
100%.
yeah, right, because even more so than not winning the title, because when you
100%.
look at because like when you look at their standings in the East, I mean they're way ahead of everybody.
It's not even
So,
close. The
yeah,
path
and
to the finals for them should be easy. If like not
right,
like easy, but
right, but
easier
like
than other teams.
like they're in the East, so
Hmm.
whoever's like the 9, 10, 8 seed or whatever, right, is not going to be remotely any challenge to
Yeah.
them, right? Like, so I mean, and then you don't have to worry about either Milwaukee or well, Philly. We'll see what happens with Embiid because
Yeah.
there's a world where he comes back, and maybe if they play them in the second round and he's just whatever.
Right.
But like in theory, like you should pretty much at least make it to the conference finals, and then from there you need to make the NBA finals because again, when you look at a lot of the analytics and the stats, in terms of like net ratings and their efficiency and everything, like this screams like you need to win the title, like
Yeah.
or at the very least make it to the finals.
Because you're good. If you don't do it, you're good for no reason. Like actually, and it would be a very, I think, big stain on Jason Tatum's career, Jaylen Brown's career. I think it would be a big stain on all these guys' careers if they came together, did it again, but they didn't win it. That would be the biggest issue for me.
And the
And like
tough
their
part is,
record is 48-12. Like right now, like you should be the favorite to win the chip. That's all I'm gonna say
yeah,
on them.
and the tough part is, like if they lose, right, there's not a whole lot of moves to be able to improve because now
Yeah.
they're in way into the second apron. So you're kind of running out of, moves that you can make to, drastically improve the team. Maybe
Yeah.
you might be able to get guys on the minimum that wouldn't normally go there because they're like, oh, I have a chance to win the title. But, like the core guys, this is pretty much the group, for probably a couple of seasons, right? Like, Holiday at some point, we'll see, how he continues to age, but he's had a very good shooting
Oh yeah.
season. So I mean, this should be the year for Boston where like this should be the year where they figure it out and pull it out. But Denver's still kind of lurking, and like there's a world where like even if the Nuggets don't have home court in the finals, you just have to win one in Boston, and if you do, right, that's where you have a pretty good shot at being able to pull off the upset.
Yeah, and it's like there's a lot going on. I think it's all like converging at the same time. There's so many storylines. There's so many teams that have a lot to prove. I feel like every team in the West, 1 through 10 has something to prove. That's the wild part. I think a little bit less so in the East, but like for the West, like you got two teams, OKC, Minnesota, they're so young, they're hungry. Denver, they're looking to back to back. The Clippers, they think they can actually win it for once. New Orleans, I think they think that they're legit. Phoenix, they put all their eggs into one basket and paid all three of these guys massive amounts of money. Sacramento, they're trying not to be frauds. Do I need to go on? Dallas, they have Luka. Like, they think it's their year, even though a lot of people don't. Golden State, the Lakers, they still think they've got one left in the tank. It's just crazy in the West. And that's what I mean. Like, I honestly don't know. Like, I feel like, we agree that Boston's wouldn't probably beat Denver, right?
I feel like if in a 7-game series, I'd have to pick the Nuggets because again, like
Same.
the thing is that the West is so much crazier than the East, and even still, like Denver is still like right there in terms of like if they win like a few more games and the teams up top lose a couple, they could get the 1 seed. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously they have 6 fewer wins than Boston, but like again, you got to factor in they're playing every night, like, some really, really good teams. And that doesn't take anything away from Boston,
Yeah.
obviously, because they're not just beating teams, they're blowing them out. So I mean, they
Yeah.
have a double-digit point differential, right? So that means that like almost every game that they play, they're winning by double digits.
Which is
But
wild. That just tells you how good that team is, like on all fronts. They're super well rounded. They're doing everything at a perfect rate, pretty much, which is insane. Like it would be a crime if they don't win the title this year. But I think there's, like I said, there's a lot going on. I guess like to look at injuries. Well, what injuries should we look at for a lot of these teams that are contending for a chip?
well, I think one that it'll be interesting to see, what happens. I guess, maybe not in terms of the chip per se, but say with Jalen Brunson, right before we got on, he was in the Knicks Cavs game and he got
Yeah.
hurt in the first minute. Hurt his knee, was listed as questionable to return. So I guess you could say it's nice that he wasn't completely ruled out initially, although
Yeah.
he ended up not playing. We'll have to wait and see, what happens because obviously if he has to miss any significant time, that pretty much is probably going to put a cap on, the Knicks season because they're
Yeah.
already without Randall. We don't know when he's coming back. They're still without Ananobi. I think he's supposed to be back relatively soon within the next, couple of weeks.
Yeah, they
Um,
think both might be back March 12th, but who knows? That could be a long shot. And then with Brunson, I
right,
think they're also saying that was a left knee contusion.
right.
So that could
So,
potentially be day to day, whatever.
right. So the hope is that he doesn't miss much time, maybe like a couple games, and
Yeah.
then he comes back and they're able, because they just got, they got the win over Cleveland, without him,
Yeah.
and that's kind of a big win because they had been sliding, right? They had been reeling as of late, right? They're
Hmm.
three, even with that win, they're 3-7 in
Yeah.
their last 10 games, and that was kind of why they've dropped to 4 because at one point they were the 2 seed,
Yes.
and then the injuries came in, and then they started falling off. So that's kind of the thing with the Knicks, where if they can manage to get healthy, they might actually be a little better than you might think.
For sure.
Um, I don't necessarily know if like if they're gonna get all the way to the conference finals, but clearly they have an established identity. They have a guy that we know can play well and take over, big games. Um, and they have a really good defense. It's just a matter of can they get enough offensively from some of these guys in the postseason, right? Can you get a good showing out of Randall, right? Can Ananobi step up and play in a bigger spot than he had been in Toronto? DiVincenzo's been shooting well. Will that continue in the postseason? And others.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that's going to be an interesting factor, right? And then the reinforcements, right? Like Bogdanovich and Burks,
Yeah.
can they help as well? So that's kind of the thing where like if they can get healthy, they might have a chance to actually be a little better than we think, despite wherever they finish in the standings. It's just again, ideally, like for the Knicks, what's the ideal matchup that you want?
Hmm.
I mean, the Philly is kind of the wild card one because if Embiid is healthy and back, right, then that obviously makes Philly a much tougher matchup than maybe some of the lower seeds. So I mean, like, I feel like if you're trying to get past the first round, you may want to avoid Philly only because we don't know. Because there's a world where, he comes back and then by the time the playoffs arrived, right, he may have enough left that he can kind of get close to what he was before his injury. And if that happens, right, then that may be really tough for some of those other teams to overcome. Like if Cleveland drops to four,
Yeah.
or, like New York drops to four, or something like that.
Yeah, because I feel like Cleveland has a huge ceiling, or not a huge ceiling, but they have a ceiling to the point where I don't think they could really get past the Knicks if the Knicks are fully healthy. I don't think they could get past Philly if Philly's fully healthy. So that's the question that I have about Cleveland, and even Cleveland, like you said earlier, they're without Donovan Mitchell, and that hurts because they've just been kind of sliding. 5-5 as well. They were number two, I think, yesterday. So hey, it is what it is, but, health is a huge factor, I think, specifically really in the East. We're looking at a lot of the, top teams. They have some big time injuries that could potentially allow for some of the other teams that are, in the 7 to 10 range to kind of creep up a little bit. Like I'm looking at Miami, maybe Indiana if they go on a hot streak, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's the tough part, about if a guy gets hurt because, you're one ankle sprain or, knee injury or whatever away from, because all these teams are really tight in the standings.
Hmm.
So you're one injury away, to one of your main guys, to dropping out, or at the very least dropping a few spots. And that can mean the difference between playing a more favorable matchup in the first round and you go further versus having to play a tougher matchup. Um,
Yeah.
because say, like a team, like a Golden State, right? Obviously they're going to be without Wiggins for a while. Obviously they have some other guys that can kind of step in and play well.
Hmm.
But, again, like, the situation for them is like, if these guys miss a little bit more time, right, then that may make it a little bit more difficult to, win just enough games to get out of that 9-10 spot, right? Because even with them going 7-3 in their last 10, right? Obviously they just lost to Boston, but even 7-3 in their last 10, they're still nine. So, ideal, and obviously Wiggins being out, that doesn't help, right? Because
Right.
he has been playing better as of late, right? To the point where, like, you no longer feel like, oh, this guy can't play. He's been playing at a level that's a lot better than what we saw earlier in the year. Um, but and that's the tough part, right? Because then you look at the top of the West and it's all tied, right? And let's say you're the 9-10 seed, if you're like Golden State or LA, or even like Dallas or whomever, and you win in the play-in and you're the 8 seed, but guess what? Congratulations. Instead of playing OKC or Minnesota, you're playing the Nuggets, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's the tough part where that could be the difference between, you know, maybe you pull off an upset, and I'm not saying what happened, but like, that's the difference between you could have a chance to pulling off an upset versus no chance of pulling off an upset unless there's an injury. So,
Yeah. It's
that's
wild. And,
right.
and
And
like
then,
even in the
again,
West, like Book is
right.
hurt or potentially hurt, so
Yeah.
that's wild.
Right, a team like the Kings, right? De'Aaron Fox, right? He's been out for a few games, right? They're 5-5 in their last 10. But they got a big win the other night, right? Where like Edwards, couldn't play in the second half, due to personal reasons, and then it
Yeah.
went into overtime, right? Malik Monk goes crazy, and then they pull out a big win. And if they lose that game, right, they probably would have dropped to 8. But instead, they're 7. But,
Yeah.
again, they're only, they're only a game ahead of Dallas, right? So, you're a couple losses away from going back down there. So
Yes,
that's
sir.
kind of the crazy part. And that's the rough part about, winning games and then also winning a title or winning a playoff series is health plays a huge factor, right? Even the teams at the top, right? If any of their core guys has to miss some time, right? Like Jamal Murray, fortunately, his ankle sprain or injury that he had against the Heat didn't cause, he was still able to play the next game against the Lakers, right? Versus, oh, it's a injury like earlier in the year where he was out for like a month, right?
Right.
That's, obviously like you could still win regular season games without Jamal Murray, but, you're at a point in the season now where you can't really afford to miss one of your core guys for like a month plus, because then that's going to bleed its way into the playoffs. And you need your main guys healthy for the playoffs. Not quite as much for the regular season, but
Yeah.
so that's something to keep an eye on for a lot of these teams, right? Say like for the Clippers, right? Russell Westbrook, he hurts or fractures his hand. Don't know how long he's going to be out, right? Obviously, it didn't seem like anybody was saying he was going to miss, like several weeks or anything. But obviously, that's a guy that had been kind of a big part of the rotation. He hadn't played as well as of late before his injury, um, right? But it prevents you from, having to play a guy like, say, a Bones Highland who had been out of the rotation,
Mhm.
and just hasn't been quite as productive as a guy like a Westbrook. So, that's something to watch out for. Obviously, it's not quite as significant because it's not one of your, like main core guys,
Yeah.
but it is a guy that can help, in a random regular
He's
season
a
game.
difference maker.
Yeah, like, because again, like all the teams, ideally need wins at this point, right? Like if you're the Clippers, you went 5-5 in your last 10. So now you're the 4 seed. Whereas if we go back to, around the All-Star break, they were the 1 seed.
Yeah.
So, and
And it's
the
wild.
difference between the 1 seed and the 4 seed is significant, right? Because generally
Huge.
speaking, usually if you want to win the title, you kind of need to be one of the top 3 seeds. Just because, again, it's easier to have home court. And you don't have to worry about like, other stuff, like playing a tougher matchup, right? Because again, the difference between playing the 5 seed may be different than playing, the 8 seed,
Yeah.
but at the same time, it also depends on who finishes, as the 5 or 6 seed, right? Because
Very true.
a team like, because a team like New Orleans, if you're the Clippers, that may be a different type of matchup than if it's like the Kings or the Suns or somebody or the Mavs or somebody like that. So,
Yeah.
you
And
know, I
this
mean,
is wild. I think the
yeah, and
NBA season has been pretty good so far.
yeah,
Definitely historic. One for the ages, I think. And I think the postseason is probably going to follow that same trend. Hopefully, we get some, masterclass performances. Hopefully, we get some surprises as well. But
yeah. I
overall, I've
mean,
really thoroughly enjoyed this season.
right. And especially, like for some of these teams, again, this is where the X factors come into play, right? For a team like Oklahoma City, right? Like, the difference between them maybe being able to, overcome win a playoff series or, lose a tough one is say like a guy like a Josh Giddey, right? Where he's a guy that hasn't played, up to snuff this season. He's had a
Yeah,
down year. But if he somehow manages, like in a 7 game series to kind of, to knock down a lot of shots because teams are going to give him open shots. That's how they're going to guard him. That can be the difference between Oklahoma City winning and losing a series, right? Because
for sure.
if he's actually playing well, he can be a productive guy, right? He can help rebound, he can help, play make. But obviously there have been a lot of games recently, at different points where he doesn't play well, and then he ends up getting benched down the stretch for, a guy like an Isaiah Joe, or even like a Hayward or somebody like that. So that's
Yeah,
something to kind of watch out for. For a team like Oklahoma City, obviously for a team like Minnesota, right? They have X factors as well, right? Say like a guys like a Jaden McDaniels, right? Like offensively, can he give you some, better performances where he's like somewhere around like 15 as opposed to like, 7 or 8 points in a game, in addition to the defense, knocking down open shots.
yeah,
Um, and other things like that. So, again, say like, with the Nuggets, right? Michael Porter Jr., that's another X factor beyond Jamal Murray as well, right? Because, say a game like LA, right? Obviously, Jamal Murray and Jokic closed out the game, but there was a stretch when LA went up early in the game, but the Nuggets were never like down by too much because Michael Porter Jr. answered the bell and he went 10 for 10.
yeah.
So like, something like that, can be a big difference. So that's the other factor as we, close out this season in the regular season and then get into the playoffs is watch out for those X factors too.
Yeah, for sure. They can be huge difference makers. And I think, pretty much every team in the playoffs is going to have one and is definitely going to need one. And I'm sure we'll do like, more in-depth breakdown on like
Yeah,
every playoff team's X factors because a lot of teams will have multiple. That's the beauty of it. Like,
yeah,
and the teams with multiple are probably the ones that are well structured to win, the title. So I'm very intrigued to see, what the final standings are going to be. I think we'll find that out pretty much within the next month or so. So, we've got about 20 games left. So,
yeah,
it's been a good fun ride though, for sure. I've enjoyed this. Like I said, we've
yeah,
literally been watching history.
yeah. I mean, basically, you got what, like 6-ish weeks left in the regular season. So I
Yeah.
mean, so this is kind of the final stretch where teams kind of figure out who they are, and what they can be by the end of the year. Because that's where it starts to get really fun, I think.
Yeah.
Um, So, in terms of the news rumors, nothing really new to report here. Obviously, there's been guys that have been bought out that have joined teams, right? Like say, like Oklahoma City, right? Mike Muscala. That's another guy that had played for Oklahoma City before, right? Veteran guy. Stretch big. Obviously you can attest to him, because he played for your Wizards. Obviously, he played
Yeah.
for my Lakers as well.
Yep.
Um, he could help them potentially. I don't know how much, he'll always play,
Right.
because again, it feels like OKC has kind of figured out, what their rotation's probably going to be. And it seems like they just prefer, to play small, right? Like, even like, it could just, it's going to depend on the matchup. And I think, with Mark Dagnall, he's done a good job as a coach. So in theory, you would think he could probably figure out, like, oh, this may be a game where we might need more of Mike Muscala and, maybe less of somebody else.
Yeah.
It just gives you a little bit more optionality. But is he probably going to be the difference between a series or not? Probably not.
No.
Same with like say the Knicks signing Shake Milton. Again, like just kind of another depth guy to add.
Yeah.
But again, by the time you get to this point in the season, in terms of guys signing with teams, these are guys that are not really going to be big difference makers. They kind of fill out the roster, and it's more so like break glass in case of emergency.
Yeah, and they know their roles. They know why they're going to be being brought in, and Muscala's there for a little bit of size and a little bit of 3 pointers, and then Shake Milton's probably going to be there for rotational scoring, whatever that can mean for the specific team, especially like the Knicks. I think it's a good pickup considering what just happened with Brunson and things like that. So people are going to be moved up in the rotation, and I think he'll fit right in. I just don't know how many minutes he would secure, but regardless, I think those are both, decent pickups, and I think they both fit the systems fairly well.
Right. And then, in addition, right, so according, to Rich Paul, right, Bronny James, right, his decision in terms of the draft is going to be dependent on team interest.
Yeah.
Right, so obviously, I guess you can kind of speak to this as well, right? Because you follow the draft,
Hmm.
and stuff like that, right? But it sounds like it's going to be more so based off of like, you know, instead of oh, you're going to go 15th or 20th, it's going to be like oh, this so and so team wants you, right? So that may kind of be the difference between him deciding to maybe go undrafted versus like something else.
Yeah. And it's wild because he was dropped from pretty much every mainstream mock draft
Right.
recently in the past like week or two. And, it's an interesting story, I think, because, a lot of people had him going early second round. Then, as
Right.
the college season kind of started to progress, honestly, some people even had him late first round before the season started, which is kind of wild.
Right.
But that kind of just told me that they didn't watch a lot of Bronny James tape because he doesn't scream first rounder. He doesn't make a lot of like the flashy plays. He's a good
Mhm.
player in terms of the intangibles and what he can do playmaking and defensively. It's just a matter of, is he NBA ready? Probably not. And I
Yeah,
think,
I
what's up?
Yeah, I think some people are of the mindset that he may be a better player in the pros than in college.
Agreed.
I think some people think mainly because of like you said the defense and the shooting, and so he could
Yeah.
be one of those like 3-and-D guys that maybe if he adds a little more like handle to his offensive game, then that's where he could really be, something really good, whereas opposed to like in college, those type of guys
Flourish.
don't always make as much of an impact.
Yeah. Because, like, the thing is, he's not the tallest guy out there, and he can play the one, but sometimes you don't really want him to play the one. And I think that's been kind of shown during his time at USC, where it looks like he doesn't really go for necessarily, the scoring play or the selfish play. He's looking to set his guys up, which is good. That's like the prototypical, player that you want to have on your team. It's just a matter of what kind of impact is that really going to have long term. So it is interesting to see him fall from late first round all the way to early second round, now late second round, and then completely out of the draft. And then some people are saying, he should go into next year's, which is an interesting take as well. It all depends on him because he knows when he's going to be ready. It's his decision at the end of the day. But I think it is smart to kind of explore your options where he has a little bit of privilege more so than other players where he can kind of see where he wants to go and who's going to take a flyer on him. May not necessarily be in the draft, but it might be due to free agency and finding the right fit. And then that's also a huge factor, I think, in where LeBron might decide to go if he decides what he wants to do with his contract. Where if he goes to a team that feels like they have a good chance at landing Bronny, I mean that would be kind of interesting, right? So I think that's another factor that we have to watch. The Bronny factor, as a lot of people would say for LeBron.
Yeah, I mean, like just kind of to give another example, Austin Reeves, for the Lakers, he talked at different points about like, yeah, Detroit was interested, in drafting me, but
Hmm.
he chose, instead, the undrafted route. because he wanted to play, for LA. I guess they were interested in him as well, but they weren't able to draft him because I don't think they had a pick.
Right.
So, and that ended up being better for him
For
because,
sure.
he's basically a starter, for a team and he's got money, earlier than he would have gotten if he had just been a regular second round pick, on like a regular 3-year contract or
For sure.
whatever they get. So,
Yeah, it paid
that's a
off.
situation. Yeah, so it paid off for him, and so maybe that's something that, say Bronny may potentially explore. Not that he's gonna go undrafted, but just is something like a precedent, I guess you could potentially say.
Yeah, but I think with his decision, it's so tricky because I think he would be beneficial in terms, or he would benefit from, maybe playing a couple years in college, because a lot
Right.
of
And
all
Reeves
time
was a
greats,
4-year
yeah,
and Reeves was a 4-year guy. He wasn't like, a 1 year and
exactly.
then we're going in the pros, but go on.
Yeah, and there's been some good players that have been like, multi-year college guys. Like I think Tim Duncan even played like 4 years in college, and he took his time and he knew what he needed to become and what he wanted to become. And I think that's the thing with Bronny. The problem is you have the LeBron factor with Bronny, where LeBron has put a little bit of pressure on Bronny and said, my goal is to play with my son. He didn't say Bryce. He was talking about Bronny, so he wants to play with Bronny, and it may not look like it, but
Mhm.
Father Time is catching up to LeBron. He's not going to admit it. It's not going to show, in his play or in his numbers, but you can tell the guy is tired mentally. You can look in his face and see, we've seen the pictures where, he looks a little bit tired, and there's times where you look at him and you can see his age, but in terms of his play, that hasn't really declined too much to the
Yeah.
point where you're worried about him retiring anytime soon. It's just a matter of what is he going to do for his family and stuff like that. So I am intrigued, how much LeBron has influenced, this, I guess, decision or leak decision for
Yeah.
Bronny. Like I don't know if it's intriguing. I just think it's a
Yeah.
really interesting story, and I'm very curious to see what happens with Bronny.
Right, and, remember we did have the thing, right, where it was like, when they took his name off the mock drafts, right, he had commented on social media, right,
Yeah,
about, "Don't pay attention to the mock drafts, leave my son's name out of this," but then he deleted the tweet, right,
yeah.
which, kinda suggested he probably shouldn't have put that out there,
Well, it's
because
because,
like you said
yeah, bro,
'cause like
it's
you said,
bad.
he put the pressure,
Yeah,
already out there. Obviously, this is an attack on him, but,
no,
like,
no, no.
obviously, it you know he put the pressure on him, because at different points, right, he mentioned something like, "Oh, my son is better than some of these guys that are in the NBA right now,"
Yes.
you know, but
And then
now
he
that
also
he's
said
not
he could play for the Lakers too at
right,
one point. Like he said he could play for us right now, which is a wild calm. I don't doubt it, but at the same time, that's not good PR. It reminds me of the LeVar Ball and Lonzo stuff, prior to, maybe not as extreme, but it's along the same lines where you're putting a lot of pressure on a kid, and if he doesn't perform, it's going to backfire on you and your son. So it's wild, and he even said like, yeah, don't pay like you were saying, don't pay attention to the mock drafts and let the kid be a kid and play. But
yeah,
initially
the
that's what
mock draft
everybody was doing, and then all of a
yeah.
sudden he decided to put out the notion of, yeah, I'd love to play with my son. And he said it over and over year after year. So
The
it
mock
is what it
draft
is.
thing is I do agree with the mock draft thing though, to be fair, like where it's like you can control, you control your destiny in terms of putting
For
the
sure.
work in, right? So like, don't be upset like if the mock drafts like,
I
change
agree.
and one but the other stuff, yeah. But shout out to him for scoring, 40K, points or
Yeah,
whatever.
shout out Braun for that. I forgot about that. That's wild.
Yeah, yeah, because that's a lot of points. That's 40,000 more than most people.
Yeah,
Because most people haven't been able to get to the NBA, and it just kind of further cements where I feel like it's going to be very difficult for that record to be broken. Because again, you have to
agreed.
play basically 20 seasons, consistently score like 25 a game or
Yeah, it's
more.
25.5, I think is the actual average.
Yeah, 25.5 a game or more and be healthy more often than not.
Yep.
And the thing is, if he continues to play, he's going to extend it. And it's not
Yeah.
like he has to score, like 30 a game to extend it. Even if he, in his last few seasons, goes down to like 21 or like, 20 a game or something like that,
Yeah.
like, as long as he's healthy, it's going to keep going up. And then it's going to be, harder. It's going to be even more out of
Untouchable,
reach.
bro.
Yeah, like in a couple of seasons, he could be at like 43 or 45 or something like that, or something like that. So
Yeah, it's wild, bro. But like, I think even KD said on IG, he was like, "Yeah, just keep raising the bar." I'm like, "Yeah, that's literally what he's doing. He raises the bar pretty much every time he makes history, and it's wild that he's doing it at the age that he's doing it at." So yes, shout out Braun for 40K.
yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, just let us know your thoughts on what we've been talking about in the comments. Like, are you guys, kind of still buying stock on Denver and expecting them, to probably pull off a repeat? You think it's going to be a different champ? Is it Boston? Do you think Milwaukee still has a shot, or the Clippers, or others? Let us know. Let us know what you think about the injuries, and everything like that. And again, join the Discord, join the community, right? The Discord's there for you to join. The link is still in the description, on the channel, on the socials and everything.
Yes,
Again,
sir.
don't also forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And we will see you Friday.